Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Gletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their diverse stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. On today's episode, Safir Boukhalfa joins us to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace and how mentoring plays a critical role in all of this. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Safir, always a pleasure. Welcome to Autism Stories.
Thank you so much, Duke. Always a pleasure to talk to you as well.
I'd love to start out and learn, where would you say your story in the autistic community begins?
I would say probably as a child, definitely early on, always very regular experience, I think, in the autistic community, growing older, feeling a bit different, wondering why, wondering how, doing a lot of tests when I was a child that were not disclosed to me, like the results were not disclosed to me. So yeah, it's been a while, it's been a journey, and now I got reacquainted with it maybe 5-6 years ago. So yeah, that's how it started, and gladly so. It's been really nice to be able to connect with people who are autistic, people who are neurodivergent at large, understand our joint experience. It's been a really nice experience for me.
Now, here in the United States, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants are really struggling to find clients right now as a result of our current political climate. So you have a consulting firm focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Berlin, Germany, driven by the vision to create workplaces where everyone, especially marginalized voices, could not only thrive, but also flourish. What's your sense of businesses and organizations as it results to creating workplaces for everyone in Berlin now?
It's a very good question. I think we live in a world globally that is affected by what happens in the US. So everything that happens in the US somehow triggers down to Europe. So there's definitely been a lot of conversations around DEI as well, around backlash and the political climate. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Europe, in most countries of Europe, it's also really polarized. We have a lot of very far right and then the left trying to get a grip a bit on what's going on, but not so successfully yet, at least. So in that context and in that climate in Europe as well, it's been very tensed. There's been a lot of conversations with organizations who are deciding to deprioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the same time, one positive thing is that the European Union is still pretty steady on it. The Council of Europe as well, that's a different entity. They're also pretty steady on it. So when you look at the public institutions, there's still more and more conversations that are happening. So I think, yeah, it's just really different to the previous years. I think there's definitely been a pre and post George Floyd in the world. And after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of organizations started to invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, wanted to make sure that their employees who were racialized, maybe who were part of the LGBTI plus community, felt a bit more comfortable. But then eventually that effervescence around the newness of it all just kind of faded away. And now we're left with, how do we continue doing this change? Because we were at a phase where in 2020 where we were starting to consider which kind of changes are needed, and now we're in a phase where it's rather about implementing it, I would say.
Now, in November of last year, you became the Spark DEI Community Chair for the European Network Against Racism Foundation. The first goal of this community is to address racialized individuals who are active DEI professionals working in Europe. what are some ways your community has done work to support these DEI professionals specifically?
Yeah, so since I started to be the chair, things have changed a bit. I mean, the communities have existed now for about 3 years. So we had a lot of conversations on what we wanted those communities to be, as the European Network Against Racism really wanted them to happen. We have one around DEI, one around teachers, and another one on academia. So it's really a lot of different things. For instance, for my community, it would be around creating a space of solidarity. So really just understanding that if you're working on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Europe, and on top of that, you're racialized, you get to experience a type of violence that is very unique because you kind of have to defend your ideas with organizations, but you also are affected by those ideas. So that creates something a bit complicated. So one of the very first thing around that community was to create solidarity, making sure that people didn't feel isolated, didn't feel alienated, because DI is going to be practiced very differently across Europe. We have people in Hungary, which makes it extremely complicated currently because there's the far right is leading the country, and there's a lot of vilifying of the LGBTI plus community. So people who practice in Hungary have very specific struggles. Then we have people, for instance, in Norway, in Oslo, we have people in Barcelona. So yeah, the main goal was to create this solidarity and remind people that it might feel very, very lonely at times, but you're not the only one working on those things. We also try to gather physically as much as possible, at least once a year. So now, for instance, we had a in-person meeting in September in Brussels, where we are looking at ways to, for instance, decolonize the curriculum. So between teachers and academia, looking at what we can do to make sure that the next generations are going to be per nature anti-racist. So that's something that is very interesting. We also are looking at ways to make diversity, equity, and inclusion as professional as possible. So trying to work on best practices, making sure that we are looking at it in a way that is as intersectional as possible, so that we don't forget that within the racialized communities, we also have people who are autistic, who are disabled, who are queer, who are maybe coming from different socioeconomical background, and so on and so forth. So yeah, trying to have a space where people can come back and hopefully be as close to themselves as possible.
This might be a difficult question to answer, but I'm wondering, you use the word solidarity. I'm wondering, in your experience, now it's hard to speak for anyone else, but in those kind of conversations with racialized DEI professionals, do they believe solidarity is possible at this point?
Honestly, I would say yes, absolutely. I think it's very clear that we have a common understanding on how to support each other more and more. And sometimes it can be just about having the possibility to speak. Over times, it can be financial help. That's something that could also happen. Maybe somebody lives in Europe and has difficulties with the healthcare systems here, because in the US, most people fantasize about the fact that healthcare is universal in Europe, and that's not the case. It's only the case in certain countries. You have a lot of countries where healthcare is pretty expensive as well. So that could be financial support. That could be a lot of different ways. But one thing that I appreciate with the people who are racialized in that sense is that most of us come from countries that are more collectivist. So we come from cultures where the collective is higher than the individual. So we are taught since childhood, how to express that solidarity. I often take the example of Algeria. I'm Algerian, where you wouldn't see so much poverty on the street. And it's not that there is no poverty, but it's rather than people would take people in. So you would take your cousin who has like a rough path with finances, help them do that. If someone had issues raising their children, maybe the children can be raised by the sisters or by the brothers. So there's this solidarity that comes quite naturally to our community because, as I said, it's quite collectivist, and that's something you see often in racialized communities. You see it as well in the US, how the help that people from the Latino communities are giving one another, people from the Black community, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think solidarity definitely is a possibility.
I think mentoring, within workplaces is a critical part of making them inclusive and accessible to everyone. So thinking about that, you've been the co-lead of an LGBTQ plus ERG in a workplace that created a mentoring program for queer people. What have you learned about mentoring within the workplace as a result of this ERG?
I definitely learned that it was more needed than I ever anticipated. I have never been keen on being mentored. It's nothing that resonated with me up to recently. And so my silly little self thought that nobody really cared for it. Turned out a lot of people actually feel extremely inspired when it comes to being mentored by people that look like them. Because we see often, for instance, if we take the queer community here, we see often that queer communities, that the higher you get in the hierarchy, especially in the corporate world, the more straight and the more cisgender it becomes. Having mentors from higher ups also gave the possibility for people who were more at entry levels, the possibility to also hopefully feel that they could achieve it. And and this is something that we see often in workforces, right? You have a lot of diversity at entry level. You have a lot of racialized people, you have a lot of disabled people, you have a lot of queer people, but then to actually get higher becomes really difficult because there's a systemic issue at hand where we don't want people to lead if they are not part of the majority group. So I think it's really beneficial for people to see that, yeah, it's actually possible, and also for the mentors. I think it's also something very helpful for the mentor on more of a self-actualizing level, where they also can look at it in a way that is, I wish I had that when I was younger, and it's like really, I think, in my opinion, it's very helpful to keep on taking care of your inner child, to know that, yeah, you might have not received the help that you hoped you had back then, but you become that person that you wish had been there for you.
Absolutely. Now, earlier we were talking about with you living in Germany, but I read that you are leaving Germany as an Algerian disabled queer person because not even in your own home can you be sure of safety. I'm wondering about community care in regards to the safety. What do you think might be some steps that each person can take to support one another as disabled and queer folks?
I think it's very important to not be alone, to really try again and again to create communities. I know that for some people who are autistic, myself included, sometimes you just appreciate the time alone a bit too much, and you forget that connecting is it's a very human aspect of it. It doesn't mean that you have to be connected 24/7, but to know at times, like to have the possibility to text someone whenever you feel a bit lonely at home or whenever you feel a bit unsafe and when you had tough day, I think can be quite helpful. I think there's also a lot of groups that you can join. I think one of the most helpful things for me was to join just communities. You are part of it. There is that common understanding that you can support each other. And for me, for instance, I tend to be the one that supports. It's pretty hard for me to receive the support. But even in this kind of settings, I've started to have conversations as well on how do we make sure that even the ones who don't ask receive some sort of support. And yeah, I think Germany has been very difficult. I think Germany has been very, very difficult. I've been here for 10 years now. And Berlin was back then a very interesting, inspiring city, and over time it's becoming more and more of a real capital city, so to say. So Berlin was considered really alternative. It was really different. And now more and more it's becoming this newer London type of city. And yeah, I mean, living in Germany right now means that you cannot really express any ideas against Zionism, for instance, if we take the example of Palestine. So there's been a lot of repression on that side. You have probably seen on some on some social media how the police is treating people who are protesting against the genocide happening to the Palestinians. We used to have a beautiful place that was called Oyun, a cultural center for everyone that also were helping migrants, we're helping queer people, we're helping a lot of people from different communities, also the Jewish community in Germany. As the conversations around Gaza and Israel started to happen, invited an organization, a Jewish organization, and then another one, a Palestinian one, to have a conversation. And the most people who are considered who are Jewish, sorry, in Germany, I would think are kind of automatically anti-Zionist because they are still living the realities of what the Germans have done to them, but that somehow led the government to cancel the funding of that cultural venue. And so from one day to another, because we had a conversation, because we dared to speak about Palestine, then that place was completely shut down. And that place was super important because, again, it was a big, big building made by us, for us, and yeah, it becomes more and more unsafe. I think there's been over the last centuries, there's been a lot of vilification of Muslim communities, and now it's been working really well because now you're not really safe on the street. And for me, I'm Muslim and I am also read as a Muslim person, so on the street people assume automatically that I'm Muslim, and so you get like stares, you get like a bit more violence, people are a bit quicker to tell you off and so on, and it culminated in the murder of a very young Algerian woman, and that murder happened in her own home. So that was also something that is like, okay, so if I'm not safe on the street and if I'm not safe at home, where can I be? And that's the decision that I've been making now, to just accept that maybe Germany is not ready for people like me at the moment, maybe later in time, but after having spent 10 years here, having worked so much on hopefully making the country a bit better, it feels necessary for me to go and recharge. I think I will keep on working with Germany. I think it's something that I'm really interested in doing, but yeah, from a distance, from the safety, hopefully, of my own home.
Now, moving on to something a little bit lighter, because that is difficult to hear. I understand you have a deep interest in language. Do you have suggestions to help people that want to learn more than their initial language they speak? Someone like me that can barely speak one language and comprehend and process it. If I somehow wanted to learn another language and speak more than one, like you, Safir, well, wait, yes.
It's such a good question, but it's so hard because I was so lucky to be raised multilingual. So I grew up speaking French, I grew up speaking Tarja, I grew up speaking English. So for me, it never felt like a exceptional thing to do. And then as I grew older, I learned a bit of Spanish. Now I'm fluent in Spanish. I learned some Japanese. I learned some Portuguese, some German as I live in Germany. But it's really hard for me to give an advice. I think what I would say to autistic people specifically on learning a language, you have to see it through the lens of pattern recognition. It's really just pattern recognition. And especially when it comes to the Western languages, we tend to think that they're so separate because they sound a bit different, while actually they have so much similarities. And I often say to people like who are native English speaking, for instance, that they could so easily speak French. And why is that? Because in English, there is 50% of the language that comes from French and Latin roots. So it's actually, instead of focusing on all of the different words, instead of focusing on the very difficult pronunciation of French, I'm very aware, it's rather focusing on what actually is in common. For instance, if you want to say, I hate you in French, you can say je te déteste. And je te déteste in English exists as I detest you. It's a bit higher register, but it exists also. And for all of them, it works. I like you. Okay. Well, I adore you. Je t'adore. Same. And all of the words always have an equivalent in the French language. So that's really where pattern recognition can help. And then eventually you see languages who feel so far away from each other and start to make this connection. I remember when I moved to Germany, I heard for the first time probieren, which means to try. And I was just thinking, that sounds familiar. That's funny. I think, wait. Oh, in Spanish, they say probar. And it sounds very different, but when you see it in writing, you can not mistake it. This is clearly the same root. So it's really about creating those connections and making it fun. It's just about making it fun, talking as much as possible. Because when we learn languages, we tend to go for grammar, we tend to go for books, we tend to go for Duolingo and all of those apps. But we forget that when we're children, the way we learn is through talking. You listen and you talk. So that's the most natural way to do it. Do a tandem. A tandem is when you meet someone who speaks another language and you spend an hour speaking their language and then another hour speaking your language. And then hopefully you manage to have conversations. At the beginning, it's going to sound very silly. You're not going to be able to make much more sense. But very quickly, you can start to understand them better and you can start to communicate as well better. So focus really on producing, like speaking. And one thing I do now for myself to keep those languages, because often people will tell you that if you speak a language, it's really hard to maintain it. I think it's not that hard. It just takes a bit of practice, but you can think in that language. 15 minutes a day, no more. And just whenever you're on the bus, instead of reading something on Instagram, on TikTok, on LinkedIn, whatever, you can directly just think for 15 minutes in the language that you want to preserve.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's really helpful, especially since patterns I'm good with. Remembering stuff I'm terrible with. So if I could focus more on the patterns in language, I think I would be better off.
You know, I think I read something a while ago. It's probably not up to date anymore, but I read something that with 500 words, you could communicate in most languages. And 500 words is not a lot. So it's all about the patterns. Like, how can I express myself with the little vocabulary that I have?
I have very little vocabulary, so I guess I can relate to that. Lastly, Safir, how can our listeners learn about you beyond this conversation?
I am pretty present on LinkedIn mainly. I use LinkedIn a lot. I also use Instagram at times. I am on Medium where I love to write a bit longer essays on different things, languages, autism, ADHD, all of the above. And my website, of course, safirboukhalfa.com, where you can reach out to me if you want to be coached, if you want to be helped within your organizations. We have a lot of different services. But yeah, you can find me kind of anywhere nowadays.
Wonderful. Well, always a pleasure, Safir. I always love our conversations. Thanks so much for being here on Autism Stories.
Thank you so much, Doug. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much to Safir for the conversation. To learn more about Safir, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode regarding if you speak multiple languages. And if so, how has this impacted how you live and view your life? Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to be the best version of their authentic selves through customized life coaching and our community groups. We also support parents and partners of autistic people by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. So please visit autismpersonalcoach.com to begin your experience of judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.
inside